All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the absolutely fascinating 180-year story of a tiny Rhode Island jeweler that grew into the ultimate American corporate status symbol. We're looking at the A.T. Cross Company. This is a brand that quite literally wrote its way into history, only to find itself really struggling to rewrite its own future.
So think about what an Apple Watch or a high-end luxury car says about a professional today. Well, decades ago, that same kind of power, that same cultural weight, was held by a pen. And it begs the question, what do American presidents, 1980s executives, and 19th century jewelers all have in common? The answer lies in a single meticulously crafted writing instrument. You see, the Cross pen wasn't just a tool for putting ink on paper. It became a defining emblem of achievement, class, and sophistication for over a century.
Section 1. The ultimate status symbol.
We're actually kicking off our story right at the peak of their cultural and corporate dominance in the late 20th century before we wind the clock back. For decades, Cross held a staggering 40% market share in the United States. Think about that for a second. In an arena historically dominated by fancy European manufacturers, A.T. Cross emerged as an unparalleled American giant. They basically invented the market for high-priced, prestigious pens in America, making their brand the absolute undisputed champion of the gift-giving market. If you're a recent college grad or an ascending corporate executive, getting a Cross pen was a true rite of passage.
To really wrap your head around the sheer luxury heights they reached, you don't need to look any further than the company leaders at the time, Bradford and Russell Boss. Picture this. It's the summer of 1977, and they're devising a corporate strategy to expand their gift empire while lounging on a chartered yacht, watching the America's Cup trials on Narragansett Bay. They realized 70% of their sales came from the gift market, which eventually led them to acquire luxury leather goods retailers like Mark Cross. I mean, they were sitting comfortably on top of a $500 million a year industry.
Moving on to Section 2, Building an American Icon.
So, how did they get to that yacht in Rhode Island? Well, the foundation of this American icon stretches all the way back to 1846. Alonzo T. Cross, an English inventor, steered his jewelry family into manufacturing gold and silver casings for pencils. Fast forward to 1879, and they introduced early stylographic pens, which were basically the technological forerunner of the ballpoint. By 1916, the Boss family acquired the company and pushed it to entirely new heights, eventually taking it public in 1971. And, following that IPO, they saw an astonishing compounded annual growth rate of nearly 20% in sales for a solid decade.
The real secret to their prestige, it was this borderline obsessive manufacturing process. We're talking about exacting standards that required 150 meticulous assembly steps, much of it done entirely by hand at their headquarters in Lincoln, Rhode Island. The machining tolerances were legendary. They ensured engraved grooves were measured to within 1/10,000th of an inch of perfection. It's truly awe-inspiring craftsmanship. If there was even a hint, just a whisper, that an inkball might clot, the entire pen was instantly discarded.
And here's the absolute kicker, a phenomenal metric that explains so much. Thanks to that intense precision, fewer than 2% of Cross pens were ever returned under their famous lifetime warranty. Just 2%. You weren't just buying luxury for luxury's sake, you were buying a guarantee of absolute perfection. That level of reliability is exactly why it became the ultimate status symbol.
Which brings us to Section 3, Missing the Mark.
Ironically, that exact perfection, it kind of led to corporate complacency. They had the market locked down for so long, they simply took it for granted. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the market shifted violently. Cross had built its empire on the slender ballpoint pen, but suddenly, consumers wanted nostalgia. They wanted the homespun utility and the quiet glamour of fatter fountain pens. European rivals like Montblanc and Waterman just surged in popularity as wholesale sales of fountain pens doubled between 1986 and 1991. Cross, however, stuck to its slow, conservative strategy. They didn't introduce their fatter fountain pens until years after the trend had already taken off. It's a classic business lesson right here, a massive brand completely failing to read changing consumer desires.
And because Cross stubbornly rested on their laurels and arrived so incredibly late to the fountain pen revival, their financials took a completely devastating hit. Between 1989 and 1993, sales plunged from $247 million down to just $165 million. Even worse, their net income nosedived from $36 million down to a mere $8 million. Almost overnight, the undisputed champion was suddenly on the ropes.
Next up, Section 4, the digital disaster.
Desperate to get their momentum back, this analog giant decided to pivot hard into the fast-paced, high-tech world of the late 90s. They formed the Penn Computing Group, teaming up with IBM to introduce a highly hyped product in 1998 called the CrossPad. Priced at $399, it was a digital writing pad that allowed users to capture handwritten notes and magically transfer them to a PC as text files. The company's leadership boasted, perhaps with a little too much hubris, that this device had the potential to triple the company's overall revenue, comparing it to the wildly popular Palm Pilot of the era.
At first, hey, it looked like a total winner, generating $25 million in 1998, but the success collapsed almost instantly. Significant, glaring problems with the product's handwriting recognition software completely alienated consumers. The very next year, in 1999, the CrossPad racked up an astonishing $24.3 million in losses. It was a really stark reminder of the risks of pivoting too far from your core competencies. This single product failure led to massive corporate net losses, forcing the company to heavily restructure and ultimately kill the digital division entirely by 2001.
Let's move to Section 5, the presidential pen.
Now, despite all those massive financial stumbles and that rough foray into tech, Cross managed to hold on to one truly irreplaceable asset, its enduring status as an American legacy. Since at least the Gerald Ford administration in the 1970s, the Cross pen has been the official instrument used by the President of the United States to sign legislation into law. These pens are often given out as highly prized souvenirs to those who attend the bill signings, which literally cements the brand directly into the mechanics of American history.
Over the decades, exact Oval Office preferences varied, but the brand itself stuck around. Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush favored the thicker Townsend model. Then, Barack Obama started out with the Townsend before eventually transitioning to the Century Second model in black lacquer.
Then, in a pretty surprising break from decades of tradition, President Donald Trump abandoned the Cross pen entirely. While his administration did place an initial order for 150 Cross Century II pens, he later ceased using them altogether, stating, quote, "It was a horrible pen and it was extremely expensive." He opted instead to sign documents using a customized Sharpie marker manufactured by Newell Brands.
However, the tradition picked right back up with the very next administration. President Joe Biden returned to the Cross brand using a Century Second roller ball with a felt tip refill, finished in black lacquer with 23-karat gold-plated appointments to sign his very first executive orders upon taking office. So the legacy, it seems, remains firmly intact at the absolute highest level of government.
And that really leaves us with this final, lingering thought to consider. A.T. Cross survived the massive shift from fountain pens to ballpoints, a catastrophic dip in 90s sales, and a genuinely disastrous pivot to digital tablets. They've restructured, closed down plants, and chased new generations with modern designs. But how long can a company built on handcrafted analog perfection survive in a world that increasingly communicates in keystrokes, texts, and voice memos? What actually happens to a status symbol when the action it represents becomes obsolete? It is a fascinating question for an iconic brand. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.